Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into something that is, well, it's a real paradox of our modern age.
It really is. It's this strange collision between cutting-edge science and some of the oldest forms of hatred.
Exactly. We're looking at sources that detail how paleogenetics, that's the study of ancient DNA,
Hmm.
has just unequivocally proven that the whole concept of racial purity is a complete biological fantasy.
Right. Our genes tell a story of constant movement, constant mixture. There is no such thing as a pure population that's been static for thousands of years. It just doesn't exist.
And logically, you'd think that would be the end of the story. Mic drop. Science proves the foundation of racism is false.
But that's not what's happening at all, and this is a core of our deep dive today. This scientific revolution hasn't silenced these ideologies. In a way, it's just opened up a new and honestly a much more complicated battlefront.
Because instead of rejecting the science, they're trying to hijack it.
Precisely. Our sources describe these people as intellectual vultures. It's a powerful image.
It is. They're picking at the most complex, the most nuanced findings of this really dense science.
Yeah, the statistical probabilities, the haplogroup frequencies, things the average person isn't familiar with.
And they're looking for any tiny scrap they can twist to feed these fantasies of superiority and separation. It's almost like an intellectual dark art.
And it's not a new playbook. This tactic of twisting science to fit an ideology has a long, dark history.
Our sources point straight back to the 20th century. When Darwin's theory of evolution came out, you might think fascists and Nazis would reject it because it conflicts with, creationism.
But they didn't. They did the opposite. They embraced it, and then they systematically distorted it to serve their own horrific agenda.
Let's really unpack that because it's so important for understanding what's happening now. The sources point specifically to how the Nazis manipulated Nietzsche,
Right, his concept of the Übermensch, the Superman.
a philosophical idea, which, by the way, was already being twisted by his own sister, Elizabeth, who was deeply anti-Semitic.
And the Nazis took that warped version and ran with it. They created this whole fantasy of the Aryan race as the evolutionary peak of humanity. It had nothing to do with what Nietzsche actually meant.
And it went beyond just social theory. It became this absolute dogmatic delusion. The sources paint a really chilling picture of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS.
Ah, the Anarabi.
Exactly. He set up this organization, the Honor Bay, which on paper was for researching ancestral heritage.
But in reality, it was pure esoteric delirium. It wasn't science.
Not at all. They weren't interested in actual genetics. They were on this occult quest for proof of Aryan superiority. They were looking for, sacred Aryan witches?
Sacred witches claiming Aryan origins in Tibet, of all places. And famously, they went searching for the Holy Grail in fascist Spain.
And that detail is so important. It shows you that rigorous science, no matter how clear it is, can't really refute a belief system that's based on dogma.
You can't. If your worldview rests on a sacred witch or a magical cup, a chart of ancient migration patterns from DNA evidence is completely irrelevant to you.
So if that was the old threat, that science just couldn't penetrate dogma, what's the modern threat? Because it feels different.
It's much more insidious.
Right.
The modern challenge is that paleogenetics, in its very genuine effort to combat racism, by showing how interconnected we all are,
By explaining these great historical migrations.
it has completely inadvertently provided a new, highly technical vocabulary for the other side.
So now modern supremacists, ultra-nationalists, these so-called racial realists, can throw around terms
Like haplogroup R1b or mitochondrial DNA or allele frequencies.
to justify new kinds of hierarchies. It gives this deceptive veneer of academic legitimacy to their intolerance.
And that's really our mission today. We need to cut through that manipulation and look at what the genetics actually says.
Okay, so let's get into the hard science. The scientific reality check, as our sources call it. This is where the actual analysis of ancient human DNA delivers what's described as a mortal blow to that whole concept of a pure white Europe.
Yeah, the story written in our genomes just isn't the simple linear one that these ideologues want to tell. It's messy, it's complex, and it's full of surprises.
The scientific counter-narrative isn't just one single finding. It's more like a breakdown of the myth built on three really solid evidence-based pillars.
Exactly. We have to look at who the first Europeans actually were, then how the trait of whiteness even developed, and finally how the entire continent was genetically, overwritten by massive invasions.
Let's start with pillar one then, the original Europeans. The core fact here, and this really runs counter to everything, is that for about 30,000 years, The native hunter-gatherers of Europe had dark to black skin.
This is such a crucial piece of deep history that just gets ignored. The indigenous people of the continent, the ones who were there for the vast, vast majority of human history in Europe, did not look like modern Europeans.
So whiteness or light skin isn't some original inherent European trait at all.
Not even close. It's a relatively recent evolutionary adaptation. The genetic evidence is crystal clear on that.
And then you add this other detail that just scrambles the picture even more. Blue eyes.
Right. Blue eyes, which people so often associate with this idea of a Northern European identity.
That mutation only emerged about 14,000 years ago, so long before lighter skin became common.
Which means for thousands of years, you had populations of early Europeans who were dark-skinned, but who might have had these incredibly striking blue eyes.
I mean, that combination alone just completely shatters the neat racial categories we use today.
It does. It shows you that if you go back far enough, the whole concept of a white European is, biologically speaking, a very recent invention. And it was the result of these massive external pressures.
Which leads us right into Pillar 2, whiteness as an imported adaptation.
Yes. So around 8,000 years ago, everything changes. There's this massive migration of Neolithic farmers who start moving into Europe from Anatolia.
Anatolia being, for our listeners, modern-day Turkey and the surrounding Near or Middle East.
Exactly. And they didn't just bring themselves, they brought the agricultural revolution with them. This completely changed the way people lived and ate across the continent.
A whole new diet.
A whole new diet. And that is the key. This new grain-heavy diet combined with the fact that Europe is at a higher latitude. It demanded a genetic change.
Right, the angle of the sun is lower. You get less UV exposure. So why was lightening the skin so critical?
It was basically a matter of survival. Melanin, the pigment that makes skin dark, is a brilliant natural sunblock. It's great if you live near the equator.
But not so great in northern latitudes.
Not at all. In a place like Europe, that melanin blocks the weaker UV rays your skin needs to synthesize vitamin D.
And without enough vitamin D, you get some serious health problems.
Devastating ones. Most famously, childhood rickets, a bone disease that would cripple you, shorten your life, and drastically reduce your ability to have children. So developing lighter skin wasn't a choice, it was a non-negotiable adaptation.
The irony here is just, it's so powerful you have to stop and think about it. The physical trait light skin that is now so prized and guarded by xenophobes
Was not a marker of some ancient indigenous European bloodline.
It was a life-saving adaptation brought to Europe by immigrants from the Middle East. It was an imported solution to a problem created by their imported technology, agriculture.
The very trait they hold up as a symbol of their exclusivity was, in fact, an immigrant's gift. And that massive change was really only the prelude to the biggest genetic shakeup in European prehistory.
Which is Pillar 3, the steppe invasion.
The steppe invasion and genetic substitution. About 5,000 years ago, a culture we call the Yamnaya pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppes.
So modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia.
Yes, that vast grassland. They swept into Europe and they transformed it completely.
This wasn't a slow trickle. The sources describe it as a fast, massive, and often violent event.
Well, they had a huge technological advantage. They were coming from the east with domesticated horses, which gave them incredible mobility and wheeled carts for logistics. They were able to essentially overrun the local farming populations that were already there.
And their attach was, it was civilization defining. Linguistically, they're the source of all modern Indo-European languages.
Everything from English and Spanish to Russian and Hindi, that entire language family, which stretches from Ireland to India, originates with them.
With one very famous, very important exception in Western Europe.
Basque, the only language that survived.
Okay, so that's the cultural and linguistic impact. But let's talk about the genetics, because the word the sources use is brutal.
It was a brutal substitution. In some places, like the Iberian Peninsula, the genetic replacement was staggering. We're talking about a situation where nearly 100% of the local male lineages, the Y chromosomes, were replaced by the incoming Yamnaya lineage.
100%. That's not mixing, that's a wipeout.
It's a demographic replacement on a scale that's hard to comprehend. To claim any kind of purity after an event like that is, genetically speaking, absurd.
Can we pause on that for a second? Because we're using terms like Y chromosome and haplogroup, and this is exactly where the manipulators love to operate. For someone hearing this for the first time, can you break down what R1b is versus, say, mitochondrial DNA?
That's a great point. Think of haplogroups as genetic clans or signatures that let us trace a direct line of ancestry way back in time.
Like a family name, but for your genes.
A very, very old family name, yes. Mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, is passed down only from mother to child, so it traces your direct maternal line, your mother's mother's mother, and so on.
And Y chromosome haplogroups.
They're passed down only from father to son, so they trace the direct paternal line. The famous R1b haplogroup is the genetic signature that is strongly associated with those Yamnaya men who swept in from the steppes.
So when we say there was a 100% replacement of the male lineage in Iberia, it means the local Y chromosomes disappeared and were replaced by the Yamnaya R1b.
Exactly. And importantly, the replacement of the female mtDNA lineages was much, much lower.
Which suggests a very specific dynamic, doesn't it?
It does. It suggests a conquest dynamic where incoming Yamnaya men killed or drove out the local men and then took the local women as partners. That's the brutal story implied by that 100% figure.
Which brings us back to that fascinating exception you mentioned, the Basques.
Yes, the Basque paradox. It's a real puzzle. As we said, Basque is the only language in Western Europe that survived from before the Indo-European invasion. So you would logically assume that the Basque people must have resisted the Yamnaya or were isolated from them.
So you'd expect to see very little of that Yamnaya R1b genetic marker in their population.
You'd expect to see the least. But the data shows the complete opposite.
It's one of the highest concentrations on the continent.
Precisely. The Basque people today have one of the highest frequencies of that Yamnaya male haplogroup, R1b, in all of Europe. It's a stunning contradiction.
How is that even possible? The language survived, but the male genetic line was completely replaced by the invaders.
It tells us something incredibly profound about identity. It shows that culture, especially language, can be incredibly resilient, while demographics can be incredibly brutal.
So the idea is that the local women who carried the pre-Indo-European mtDNA passed on the language to their children.
Even though those children were carrying the Y chromosome of their invading Yamnaya fathers, it just demolishes that simplistic idea that genetics, culture, and language all travel together in one neat little package. They don't.
Okay, let's move into part 2, because this is where it gets even more ironic. Genetic ironies and the symbolism of hate. This part of our research really exposes the profound historical amnesia required to hold these beliefs.
It's truly amazing. It shows how modern supremacists will grab onto a genetic trait as a symbol of their identity, with absolutely no idea where that trait actually comes from.
And the prime example of this is the strange, deeply ironic case of the glass of milk.
Ah, yes, this is a perfect illustration. So as we just discussed, the Yamnaya people from the steppes were the main spreaders of the gene for adult lactose tolerance throughout Europe.
Right? That was their superpower. It gave them a massive evolutionary advantage. They could get high-value nutrition from dairy their entire lives.
Meanwhile, the Neolithic farmers they encountered couldn't process lactose efficiently after they were weaned as children.
So fast forward 5,000 years. What happens?
Today, this very trait, the ability to drink milk as an adult, is used by alt-right groups in what our sources call ostentatious demonstrations.
You see it online. They post videos of themselves chugging milk to prove their, quote, white superiority.
And here is the punchline. The paleogenetics proves, without a doubt, that this ability comes directly from those ancestors on the steppes.
People who are the progenitors of, among others, modern Slavic peoples.
Exactly. Now, who were the ultimate proponents of racial purity in the 20th century? The Nazis. And what was the Nazi view of Slavic peoples?
They deem them Untermensch, subhuman.
The irony is just. It's devastating to their entire narrative. The very genetic marker they are celebrating today as a symbol of their supposed superiority traces directly back to a population that their own ideological heroes considered genetically inferior and planned to exterminate.
They're literally celebrating the genetic legacy of the people they were taught to hate.
It's a level of cognitive dissonance that's hard to fathom.
So the paradox is, it's just devastating to their whole argument. But wait, I have to ask. If the genetics were there, why didn't the Nazis ever try to co-opt that? I mean, a trait that gives a clear physical advantage seems like something their propaganda machine would love.
That's a great question, and the answer is because they couldn't. Their so-called science wasn't investigative, it was deductive. Meaning they started with their political conclusions, Slavs must be inferior, and then they tried to make the facts fit. Any real biological evidence that contradicted that, like this genetic trait, would have been completely ignored or dismissed. The ideology was the only thing that mattered.
The political need to see them as subhuman was more important than any biological reality.
Precisely. So these modern groups are literally, and I mean literally, celebrating the genetic legacy of the very people their own ideological heroes plan to exterminate.
They're raising a glass to a genetic marker of conquest that came from a population, their own idols, considered racially inferior.
The entire foundation just crumbles. It's built on a complete ignorance of the very history and biology they're trying to claim.
That's an incredible contradiction.
Huh.
Which brings us to our next point. This milk drinking display, we see it in North America in parts of Europe, but does it happen everywhere?
No. And that brings us to the Iberian Peninsula, specifically Spain.
The Spanish case.
Our sources are clear on this. The local counterparts, Spanish far-right groups, they generally do not do this. It's not part of their symbolic language.
Even though Spain has a huge dairy culture, right?
Yeah.
Amazing cheeses.
Absolutely. But if you or a tourist went to the middle of Madrid and started ostentatiously chugging milk for a camera, people would think you were, well, a fool. They'd just be confused.
And the reason for this isn't a lack of extremist politics in some circles. It's biology again.
It's genetics again. That Yamnaya gene for lactose tolerance, it just wasn't as successful in Iberia as it was further north.
How unsuccessful are we talking?
The estimates vary, but they suggest somewhere between 20 and 40% of the Spanish population is lactose intolerant. Some sources even push that as high as 70%, especially in the south.
70%. That's a huge number compared to, say, Sweden or Britain.
It is, and it's attributed to the long, complex history of genetic mixing in that region over thousands of years, including with North African populations. It just prevented that one gene from becoming totally dominant.
So the symbol fails because, there's a good chance a big chunk of your target audience would get sick if they tried it.
Basically, yes. The tool doesn't work. But our sources point to a different cultural marker, one that has its own history of exclusion.
And that is?
An obsession with pork.
Right. Gimon, the cured ham, is practically a national symbol.
It is. And while it's not a genetic marker, the source material links this deep cultural affinity for pork back to the Reconquista and the Spanish Inquisition.
So?
Well, historically, eating pork was an easy way to prove you weren't secretly practicing Islam or Judaism. During the Inquisition, publicly eating ham could be a demonstration of your Catholic faith.
It's a dietary purity test.
In a way, yes. It served as a cultural barrier. Now, we have to be really careful here.
Of course. You can't say that everyone grilling sausages today is doing it for racist reasons. It's a huge part of the national cuisine.
Absolutely not. But we have to report what the sources say, and that historical context is there, and it has modern echoes. The sources point to the province of Almeria, for example.
Which has a history of racial tension and a large immigrant population from North Africa.
A very large Muslim population, yes. And yet the sources describe this deep-rooted summer custom of massive barbecues, just filling the air with the smell of pork.
So, again, you can't say the barbecues themselves are for racist reasons.
No, you can't assert that. But issues do come up when that strong cultural preference bleeds into institutions. Things like hospital menus or school lunches that default to pork can create real friction because historically Spain was so homogenous until very recently.
So pork becomes this powerful non-genetic cultural marker of Spanishness in a way that milk just can't be.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it perfectly sets up the next paradox. The Slav-Germanic paradox.
Nazi ideology was built on this rigid, completely false hierarchy.
Yeah.
You had the Germanic peoples at the very top.
And Slavic populations at the bottom, deemed inherently inferior, fit only for slave labor or annihilation.
But the genetics just shatters that. Our sources detail that modern Germans and other Central Europeans carry a high percentage of a haplogroup called R1a.
And R1a is the sister branch to R1b. It's the marker that is highly characteristic of modern Slavic countries. It represents the eastern wing of that same Yamnaya expansion from the steppes.
So what the science reveals is that these two groups that Nazi ideology set up as polar opposites, as master and slave,
are, genetically speaking, cousin brothers.
They come from the exact same ancient migrations and hybridizations. The entire premise of that Nazi hierarchy, the idea that one group was pure and the other was some separate inferior stock, is biologically baseless.
And this is why the modern tactic has shifted. Outright rejecting the science is just too difficult now. The evidence is too strong.
So they can't deny the facts.
So they have to pivot to manipulating the complexity of the facts. If the basic findings are inconvenient, then you have to find a way to exploit the statistics, the error bars, the nuances.
And that leads us directly into part 3, the modern manipulation tactics. How do they actually do it? How do they take this incredibly dense scientific data and spin it into propaganda that works?
It's quite sophisticated, and our sources outline several key methods. The first, and maybe the most subtle, is exploiting the very nature of scientific uncertainty.
What do you mean by that?
Well, good science always acknowledges its own limits. Paleogenetics is based on ancient DNA samples, which are, incredibly rare and often damaged.
So scientists always talk in terms of probabilities, confidence intervals.
Exactly. They always leave room for the fact that the models could be updated when more data comes in. That's just standard, rigorous practice.
And the manipulators twist that.
They twist that necessary scientific caution into a fundamental doubt about the core findings. They essentially take a statement like, this is our most likely model based on current evidence, and reframe it as, see, it's all just a guess, so my wild theory is just as valid.
We see a perfect example of this in Spain, with the attempt to rewrite the whole Yamnaya story.
Absolutely. In Spain and Portugal, there's a fringe movement that promotes the bell beaker culture, the vaso campaniform, as this uniquely pure and local European origin point.
Their goal is to deny that massive genetic replacement we talked about, the one from the eastern steppes. They want a purely Western European origin story, untainted by the East.
But the genetic reality is that the bell beaker people were the primary vectors for that Yamnaya R1b gene. They were the ones carrying it. So, by focusing on the bell beaker name, they're trying to obscure the genetic origin and deny the reality of that Eastern invasion and replacement.
It's a semantic game to hide a genetic reality.
It is, and they use a similar tactic when it comes to more recent Spanish history, denying the Semitic and Moorish heritage.
How did that work?
They exploit the statistical variations in different studies. The percentage of North African or Jewish ancestry in the Spanish population can vary, sometimes up to 30%, depending on which region you're looking at and which historical period the study focuses on.
And they seize on that variability.
They seize on it to sow doubt. They'll say, well, this study says 5%, but this one says 15%, so clearly the science is unreliable and we can't trust any of it.
It's a classic case of selective focus. They'll amplify any mention of Celtic or Visigothic lineages, the acceptable Germanic inputs, while trying to dismiss the enormous and defining genetic contribution from North Africa and the Middle East.
And they have to studiously ignore the inconvenient facts that don't fit the narrative, like the Canary Islands.
What about them?
Our sources point out that in some of the Canary Islands, the female mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, is up to 60% Aboriginal African. That's a massive, undeniable link to Africa that you just can't argue away.
This strategy of selective history, it's not new either. The sources remind us of Francisco Franco's very strange selective anti-Semitism.
Right. He didn't just reject all Jews. He made this bizarre distinction, classifying Sephardic Jews, those with a long history in Spain, as good, and Ashkenazi Jews as bad.
As if the Spanish soil itself had some kind of purifying power.
It's a dogmatic belief, not a scientific one. But let's get to the most technical tactic, because this is their visual weapon. The distortion of principal component analysis, or PCA.
Okay, we need to break this down simply. What is PCA?
PCA is a statistical tool. It takes thousands of tiny genetic variations from a huge number of people and plots them on a chart. It's a way to visualize how genetically similar or different various populations are to each other.
And when a real population geneticist looks at a PCA plot, what do they see?
They see a cloud, a continuum. They see vast overlaps between populations, showing a constant flow of genes between groups. The visual story is one of connection and relatedness.
But that's not what the manipulators show.
No. They take that data and they distort it. They'll exaggerate tiny, statistically insignificant differences in haplogroup frequencies to create the illusion of separation.
So if I'm a listener and I see one of these charts online, what's the red flag? How do I spot the manipulation?
The biggest red flag is usually visual amplification. They'll literally stretch the axis of the graph. They take a tiny bit of genetic distance, blow it up visually, and then draw a hard line around it and call it a race. They present these small variations as if they're insurmountable racial barriers.
They manufacture separation where the science actually found connection.
Precisely. And our sources note that certain fascist sectors in Spain have become particularly skilled at this. They learn just enough of the jargon to sound credible while sowing confusion.
To really drive home how this tactic of statistical doubt works, the sources use a powerful, non-genetic parallel.
Yes, the recent Spanish Ombudsman report on pederasty in the Catholic Church.
The report came out with a shocking number, potentially up to 440,000 cases of abuse hidden since the 1940s.
And what was the immediate response from church-affiliated groups? They didn't try to claim there was no abuse. That would be impossible.
Instead, they attacked the methodology.
Immediately. They argued that the number was an extrapolation from an unreliable small sample size of people surveyed. They tried to discredit the entire finding by creating doubt about the statistics it was built on.
And that's the exact same tactic they use against paleogenetics, which also relies on statistical extrapolation from small ancient samples. It's a core strategy. If you can't deny the conclusion, you attack the math.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about twisting current genetic data, but part 4 of our research details an even more ambitious project: the attempt to rewrite the very origin story of humanity.
Yes, this is what the source is called the Northern Side Story. It's a clear agenda to revive these old Eurocentric narratives that try to claim some kind of biological primacy for Europe.
And the goal is to decouple the white man from his African roots.
Which is, of course, where the overwhelming scientific consensus says humanity began. But these fringe theories provide fodder for those who want an alternative.
The first major claim they use centers on a hominid called Greco-Pithecus, or El Greco.
Right. There was a controversial analysis in 2017 that suggested this 7.2 million-year-old hominid could be the oldest direct human ancestor, which would move the cradle of humanity from Africa to the European Mediterranean.
But there's a very dark shadow hanging over this particular fossil, isn't there?
A very dark one. The original mandible was found in 1944 near Athens. The man who found it was a German geologist named Bruno von Freiberg.
And he wasn't just a tourist.
No, he was a Nazi geologist on site while the German occupation forces were building a bunker. So this attempt to resurrect his find, to claim European primacy, has this direct, undeniable historical stain of racial ideology attached to it.
So what's the actual scientific verdict on El Greco? Is there any truth to this European origin theory?
The consensus is overwhelmingly no. Top paleontologists, people like Tim D. White, Rick Potts, have pretty much dismissed it. The evidence is almost entirely based on a few fragmented dental roots.
Which they've called too flimsy.
Too flimsy and a resurrection of a trait argument. The mainstream scientific community just does not see it as credible evidence for shifting human origins out of Africa.
There's a second claim they use involving another fossil named Danuvius guggenmosi, or Udo.
Yes, Udo was found in Bavaria, dated to 11.6 million years ago. And the controversial claim was that this ancient ape already walked upright, that it was bipedal.
Which would push that key human trait way back in time and place it in a European context.
Again, the evidence is incredibly shaky. Experts in the field have argued very forcefully that you simply can't deduce something as significant as bipedalism from the few fragmented bones that were found.
So we have two theories, both promoting a kind of European first narrative, and both are largely rejected by the scientific community. So why are they still so dangerous? Why should we care if the experts have already dismissed them?
Because they provide oxygen for the agenda. They're powerful propaganda tools. It's not about winning the debate in a peer-reviewed journal. It's about generating headlines.
Headlines that create ambiguity in the public mind.
Precisely. If the average person sees one headline that says, humanity came from Africa, and another that says, scientists question African origin of man, they don't dig into the details. They just walk away thinking the science is unsettled.
So the goal isn't to prove their theory is right. It's just to sow enough doubt that people don't fully accept the established one.
They thrive in that manufactured ambiguity. It keeps their narrative alive, even when it has no scientific legs to stand on.
Okay, let's bring all of these threads together and focus on one specific place that serves as the ultimate case study for all this genetic irony and manipulation. Spain.
Spain is just an exceptional example. Geographically, it's a frontier, a bridge to Africa, a gateway to the Mediterranean, a part of Europe. For thousands of years, it has been a crossroads.
Which makes it an incredible genetic melting pot.
One of the richest on Earth. But our sources make an interesting point about Spanish history. For a long time, the social obsession wasn't so much with biological racism, with the exception of the horrible, long-standing discrimination against the Roma people.
The focus was more on religious and cultural purity.
Exactly. The expulsion of the Jews and Moors during the Inquisition, it was about forcing a single homogeneous culture and faith. And that push for cultural purity was often a way to mask these deep, brutal internal problems like classism and inequality.
So the idea of purity has always been a tool to maintain a social hierarchy, whether it was based on faith or later on blood.
Absolutely. And when you look at where modern Spanish fascists project their myths of purity, they almost always look to the Northwest.
To regions like Galicia, Asturias, Leon, northern Portugal.
They idealize this area as a kind of pure Celtic heartland, supposedly descended from Central European immigrants.
And they focus on these foreign aristocratic origins, the Visigoths, the later Germanic dynasties. They find the roots of true Spanishness in these elite foreign conquerors.
But the history books tell a very different story. Our sources give us a fantastic reality check here. Those foreign Visigothic elites, they were often hated by the local Iberian population.
In fact, that popular discontent was one of the major reasons the Muslim invasion in the 8th century was so successful.
Yes, the local people were so unhappy with their supposedly pure Germanic rulers that many of them either didn't resist the invaders or actively welcomed them as an improvement.
Okay, but here comes the final knockout punch, the ultimate genetic irony that our sources reveal.
It's a beautiful, perfect contradiction.
Those very regions in the Northwest that the ultranationalists hold up as the bastion of pure Celta.
Are precisely the areas that have the highest genetic legacy of Muslim, North African, and Sephardic Jewish ancestry in the entire Iberian Peninsula.
Let that sink in. The place they think is the purest is actually the most mixed in this specific way. How did that happen? What's the historical reason for that?
It's a story of refuge and survival. During the Inquisition, as Jews and Moors faced brutal persecution in the centers of power like Andalusia and Castile, they fled.
And where did they go?
They sought refuge in the more rural, peripheral, and often less tightly controlled regions of the north and the west. They went where they could hide, assimilate, and survive. Many also crossed over from Portugal.
So the supposed pure heartland is, in reality, a historical sanctuary for the very ancestries the ideologues are most desperate to deny.
It makes the entire claim of a pure Spanish race not just a biological joke, but a complete contradiction of its own history. Every wall they try to build around their identity is just undermined by the reality of their own genes.
And that really brings us to our final section, part 6, the folly of percentages and the path forward. Because this paradox is made even more complicated today by the boom in commercial DNA tests.
Oh, absolutely. These commercial tests, the ones that tell you you're 30% Viking or 15% Italian, they can be fun, but they can also be incredibly misleading if you take them too literally.
For a scientist, those percentages are, what, simplified statistical estimates?
They're entertainment, mostly. They're imprecise statistical models that give you a very broad strokes picture over a relatively short period of time.
But for a racist or an ultranationalist, they see those numbers as something else entirely.
They see them as certificates of blood purity. They misinterpret a statistical estimate as a definitive, static truth.
It just highlights the total futility of their project. The real story our genes tell is one of constant sharing, migration, and survival. Trying to isolate one pure part of it is like, I don't know, trying to find the one original snowflake in a river.
It's impossible. So you have to ask, if the science is so overwhelmingly clear, why does this outdated racist discourse persist so strongly, especially in a place like Spain where the contradictions are so stark?
What do our sources say is the motivation?
They suggest that at the end of the day, it's often not really about genetics at all. It persists as a cultural cliche that is used to cling to economic and social power.
It's a tool to maintain discrimination and social hierarchies.
Exactly. And it works because it can exploit the relatively low scientific literacy in the general population. They can spin these complex ideas because most people don't have the background to call them out on it.
So the biological truth is just an inconvenience that has to be manipulated to preserve a useful social lie.
And as we've seen particularly in Spain, the claim of a pure race is just laughable when you consider its history as a global crossroads for millennia. Every time they double down on this exclusionary myth, they are just fighting against the fundamental reality of their own DNA.
The science reveals this profound truth. The regions most obsessed with denying their Semitic and North African past are the very places that hold the highest concentration of those genes.
They are, completely unknowingly, hating the very genetic signature that makes their regional history so unique and resilient.
And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you, our listener, to take away from this deep dive. What does this fundamental conflict, the fact that the ideological claim is biologically impossible, really tell us about the deep psychological crisis that's driving these worldviews? What happens to an ideology when genetic science forces a supremacist to unknowingly hate the very ancient genes that they themselves carry?
That internal biological contradiction where the truth of our shared mixed heritage is written right there inside their own cells. That might just be the most powerful antidote we have.
A profound thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the genetic war against racial purity. We'll see you next time.